I definitely suffered PTSD at the hands of the medical industry in Canada. What happened was really bad. And I still, if I think about, and it wasn't one thing, it was several things. And if I think about it, I can easily cry or feel angry.
That was Katrina Prescott. I'm Cynthia Iorio, and this is Lead with Love. When the denial wears off, there is a really big, stark reality to the situation that you're facing ahead. And there's really no concept of self when you're caring for another person. Not initially, anyways. It can throw you off center. I know for myself, at the time that I took on the role of caregiver, I was in my mid-30s. My life didn't totally turn out the way I had expected. I hadn't been married yet. I didn't have any kids, but I had a thriving career and I was working my way up the ladder and things looked exactly the way I had hoped. And I was living this really beautiful life in downtown Montreal, this single independent woman. And I was just kind of going through the motions, trying to live out my life to the dreams and the expectations that I had set out for myself from a young age. I had done some therapy and was working on this concept of self and working on this version of me that I wanted to be. And then everything was ripped from me. Everything that I had come to expect of the world looked very, very different. I didn't attach myself to an identity of someone who was going to grow old without parents. At the time, it was without my mom. So let's be real. I didn't attach myself to the role of a woman who would be aging without her mom. Now, my mom lost her mom when I believe my grandmother was 63 and my mom was in her early 40s, if I'm not mistaken. But I always thought of myself as having my mom there. And even though I couldn't say the word death or dying, I mean, I did know that it was a possibility, it was a probability, but I couldn't really process what that would ultimately mean for me. And the further along we got into her illness, the further away from myself and any identity that I had made for myself up until that point, I felt. So her illness progressed and my sense of self diminished. And being around suffering, illness, being stuck at home, COVID hadn't happened yet, so I was home almost every single day, inside the house all the time. Being ripped from things I had become accustomed to, things that used to bring me joy, really started to eat away at my ability to see a future for myself. And then this is the crazy thing, when I would try to do things for myself, everyone had an opinion. And I remember this clear as day. I had booked an appointment to go to a spa with a friend of mine. I had someone who was going to be there with my mother. And my cousin said to me, let's go to a spa and let's just take a day and go lay in the bath. You need the respite. You need the quiet. And I said, great. And so I did. I went. And as we do in times of social media, I posted the picture of my cousin and I on social media. And I got a message from one of my mother's friends afterwards. And the message just tore me apart. How dare you go to a spa at the time when your mother's dying? Don't you know how bad this looks? She needs you now. And I thought to myself, am I not even allowed to take time for myself? Now I'm being perceived as not doing well enough, as not doing enough, not doing what I should. And then already I was completely insecure and trying to navigate this role as it was ever changing and making sure that I was staying on top of all the things. And that, it just tore me down. And I knew that there were things I could and should be doing. And then every time I did it, it didn't feel didn't feel right. I just felt completely alone. And that's the thing too, is you can know all the things to do. You can be very aware and people can tell you to do these things. And, you can read all the advice on the websites. And but then once you're actually going through it, it's a completely different experience. And it was fascinating to me when I was speaking with Anita, the executive director of education at the Teresa Delar Palliative Care Center, that she actually had something very similar happen to her and felt something similar.
So I'm a caregiver for my mom who has advanced dementia. And my father is an early diagnosis of Alzheimer's. So I think what I have realized, and maybe I can share a story. My mom's deterioration was rather rapid. And I remember sitting at her apartment with a social worker who was talking to me about, my mom's prognosis and the changes that I can expect. And I remember getting so overwhelmed with emotion that I started to cry. And the social worker said to me, "Boy, it looks like you're in a lot of distress and you're feeling a lot of guilt. And I think you should go to this talk on learning to live with guilt and being a caregiver." And so I was crying and I said, okay, what's this talk? And she referred me to my talk. That I was giving was Dr. Mehta presenting on how to be a caregiver and live with resilience and integrate, your strengths and not feel guilty about it. And it was in that moment where I realized the duality of the roles. Sort of what I was sharing with you, that you can be a caregiver at the same time and you can have these other identities. And so for me, it's now been sort of using to my advantage the duality of those roles. But personal experience as a caregiver, I think one thing I've learned to live with is the fluctuation of emotion, is the feeling sad at the same time as feeling happy when she recognizes me, the ongoing grief from the moment I realized that my mom was going through something and that there's a chronic deterioration there. So I think the emotional piece is really important to recognize the transition of feelings that a family caregiver can have. Sometimes even being surrounded by people who want to help, there can be a really deep sense of isolation. And I think that has been very lonely sometimes. And the other piece related to the caregiving experience is sometimes just learning to navigate the healthcare system. And I think I'm in a little bit of an advantage having been immersed in it for my professional career. But I think some of the challenges that we need to be sensitive to for family members is it's not an easy system to navigate. And sometimes it can be overwhelming trying to figure out who to call and what to do and where to take the patient and where to get some reprieve from that caregiving role. So I think those are some of the key aspects that I have learned being a family caregiver and a healthcare professional at the same time.
Thank you for sharing that with me. And I'm sorry for the isolation and the feelings that all of that brings up. And I appreciate your candor and your honesty. This feeling of losing myself, this feeling of being completely buried every week by something new, something heavy, something more to have to deal with. In hindsight, looking back on it, made me feel like I had nowhere to turn and made me feel like I couldn't breathe. And when I was talking to my girlfriend, Jessica, who you heard from in a couple of episodes back, I asked her, what did it feel like to lose me for a year as I was losing myself? And it was really, really interesting to hear what she had to say. Relationships are give and take. The dynamic is give and take. What was it like for you to lose me for that year? Because there was no giving to you.
But I'll tell you something about that. It's not what you think. Because you said, with a certain sense of finality about it, to lose me for that year. I didn't lose you. And I'll tell you why. Because in the midst of it all, you were still there for me. You were still asking me questions about myself. You were still following up on stuff that was going on in my life. And you won't remember it.
No, I have zero recollection of this.
No, and I would say to you, Jesus Christ, OC, Seriously.
Yeah.
Not enough going on. And you'd be like, no. I want to talk. So you established quite early on what you needed because you could.
Right.
And that was to try to maintain some normalcy.
Right.
You wanted to talk about, just regular bullshit.
Things that had nothing to do with what I was dealing with, just as a reminder.
Exactly.
Actually, now that you say that, yeah, I do remember how liberating those conversations were to talk about nothing.
And sometimes you were like, you know what? I don't even want to. And I'm like, okay, fine. We'll play whatever game you want to play because whatever it is, that's my game too. And you wanted that. And so we did that. So I feel like I lost you. I didn't lose you, but I watched you lose you.
I did.
So, but I had that. See,
But you did have the ankle. But I do feel, and this was something I did turn to as trying to make sense of everything in the chaos and the, watching somebody suffer, progressively getting worse over, 11 months. It makes you question everything. It made me question everything. It made me question, like, what is this world for, and I turned to spirituality and not intentionally either. It was, I got access to, somebody had gifted me Eckhart Tolle's book, A New Earth, 10 years earlier. And I had opened the page and read the first page and I was like, what the heck is this? And I shut the book. And then lo and behold, I decided to reach out on my bookshelf and read it again while I was going through this with my mom. And it was like this kind of the beginning of what I like to call my awakening and my healing process, and just trying to, but I became very inquisitive and very philosophical. And so I find that even though you were holding my ankle, it was like I was shedding a skin of some sort, or I was,
I was happy to see that.
When you're in the thick of caregiving, things don't quite feel real at times, and you can almost feel like an imposter in your own life. Some of the most impactful messages and moments of support that I received when I was caregiving for my mother and then for my father were messages like, I'm here for you. If you want, don't respond to this, just thinking about you. And these are messages from friends who were literally just checking in and giving me a heart and saying hi. It was like they were holding on to my ankle to make sure I wasn't floating away into the ether. Seeing the names of those people pop into my DMs and just sharing a moment of connection helped me to feel and to remind me of the part of me that had gone by the wayside. Just that note of saying I didn't need to respond back made all the difference. Nobody ever takes on caring for a loved one with the thought that they're going to burn out. It's not like there's this conscious decision to entirely give up oneself to save another person. But I'll tell you, as the demands grow and the things get more complicated, it can certainly feel that way. It can happen so fast without any notice. For me, it literally felt like 1 minute I had everything under control and the next I was drinking from the fire hose. As the responsibilities become more complex, as time becomes more scarce, the world can feel like it's closing in. When I wasn't thinking about the medications and the appointments and the treatment options, I was worrying about my parents' finances, the evolution of their symptoms, keeping the entire family up to speed. It was just so much that was on my plate. I think back to the person that I was prior to caring for my parents, and I feel like I was walking through the world with blinders on. And I was going through life, hitting the milestones, doing the things that were expected of me. And that's just how life went. And it was the chaos and the craziness of having to face the fact that my parents weren't going to be with me, or my mom first and then my dad are not going to be with me until I get older, until they get older, that we weren't going to have the traditional trajectory of, how your life is expected to go, that it made me like coming to that realization that wasn't going to happen just completely shattered my expectation of what life was supposed to be. And it gave me, I now see the opportunity to create a life that I want for myself. But at the time, I was completely lost. And the process of coming back to me and coming and creating this new version of myself is a long one. When my mom died, the question that I had, the main question that I had in my head was, what's going to happen to all of the memories that she and I shared together? With my dad, the question that I had was, well, now that I don't have either of my parents, who am I and who do I want to be? Like, what are my values? And I didn't realize that I was walking around with this heavy expectation on my shoulders that was placed there by family values, by culture, by society. And I will never say that I felt like an orphan ever. I know that some people say that sometimes when you lose your parents, that it feels like you're an orphan. I was not orphaned. But the reality is that if I make a decision that neither of my parents is okay with in my life today, I'm not going to hear about it. And that's liberating in some way, and it's terrifying in another. But I had to learn how to let go of the version of me that was both of my parents' illnesses to become the version of me that has now lived through all of that and wants to set new rules and boundaries and expectations for her own life. If you like what you heard today, please follow, rate, or subscribe to Lead with Love on the podcast platform of your choosing. Be sure to check Lead with Love out on Patreon, where you can subscribe for exclusive access to extended interviews and behind-the-scenes content. We'll see you back here next week.